What's up, everybody? Trip Morgan here for Panthers Source. Going to talk about this Carolina Panthers trade that went down yesterday, right before the start of free agency and the legal tampering period on Monday. There's been a lot of trades going around, but as you probably saw, Torrey Smith for Daryl Worley. We're going to get into all that. But as we're sitting here waiting, and you're going to watch this intro, go ahead and hit like and follow us right here on Facebook. It's all at Panthers Source. It's this simple. At Twitter, it's at Panthers Source. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's also at Panthers Source all across the board. So y'all be sure to do that. It's really easy. We're going to cue this intro, and then I got a special guest that's going to join me. Here we go. So what's up, everybody? Like I said, I'm Trip Morgan here with Panther Source to discuss this trade talk, or not talk, the trade that went down yesterday with the Panthers and the Philadelphia Eagles. And I've actually got a friend of mine from 24/7 Sports, Carolina Panthers. He's the contributor, writer over there for them, covers the Panthers for the CBS Sports partner, Steven Igoe. Steven, what's up, buddy?
What's going on, Trip? Big news yesterday for the Panthers, man. It was fine. It was about time something finally happened.
Yeah, it's not normally something you see in Carolina a lot. It's never, you don't normally get the trade stuff going down, and when it does, it's typically sometimes can be underwhelming and people aren't happy with it. And actually, that's kind of what happened with this one, honestly, wouldn't you think? I mean, for a lot of the fans, judging off of social media anyway.
Yeah, it was kind of funny because the initial reaction that I kind of gauged from social media was, we finally got our receiver. And then I think people started to realize what really took place in the trade from a financial perspective. And that Carolina's given up a young, controllable player for cheap and Daryl Worley, who, had his ups and downs. And I'm sure we'll get into that side of things too here in a minute. But, I don't think it's the perfect trade for the Panthers. I definitely don't think it's really a negative trade for the Panthers, like so many want to kind of throw out there and already starting to bash Marty Hurney, because everybody knew the Panthers had to acquire a receiver. Was this the proper route? Time will tell, but I do think there are positives to this trade. And I think, as with any trade, it works out or as with any trade, theoretically, it should work out for both teams and make both teams better. And if Carolina fills in Daryl Worley's spot at cornerback in a positive manner and continues to build on some of their other weaknesses, I think it can work out for the Panthers in a positive manner in the short term.
Yeah, and if you're just joining us, I agree, Steven. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the Philadelphia Eagles and the Carolina Panthers trading for wide receiver Torrey Smith. The Panthers traded young cornerback Daryl Worley. He was actually a $650,000 cap hit this season for the Panthers. Carolina will absorb Torrey Smith's contract, which they can technically get out of this before the new year, before the season starts. But it's a $5 million cap hit. Daryl Worley, like I said, was $650,000. A lot of people are upset because it's, whole season actually. All you heard of, Panthers fans talking about was, God, Daryl Worley's getting beat and how they hated him. And now all of a sudden it's funny how this thing happens. And it's like, well, he was still young and flashed. I mean, why are we giving up everything for an older veteran guy like Torrey Smith, who struggled with drops last year and kind of has throughout his career? And I think a lot of people got caught up, myself included, with the Sammy Watkins hype, and some even with the Allen Robinson, though I don't think he was ever really going to be a big target. But, like we were talking about, Sammy Watkins was the guy I was pulling for. This is the guy I wanted Carolina to go after. I felt like he'd be the perfect complement to Devin Funchess. But Ron Rivera, Marty Hurney, Norv Turner all kept talking about was a veteran presence. And, Rivera specifically mentioned Jericho Cotchery at the combine presser he had. And then also speed. Those are the two things they wanted to address. And I think, I wrote an article the day before this trade went down saying, not many people were talking about Torrey Smith, but this is a guy that checks every boxes. He's won 2 Super Bowls with 2 different teams. He brought that attitude to the Eagles, as writers there have stated. And then he has speed. He ran a 4.36 at his combine. Now, granted, he's 29 years old now, but he's certainly not old. I mean, he's shown he still has that potential to stretch the field.
Yeah, and I think, I saw some people throughout the Ted Ginn comparison.
Yeah.
We all know how much Carolina missed that stretch the field from a vertical threat standpoint. And even if Torrey Smith isn't catching 10 passes for 100 yards a game, it still goes back to that, just having that threat, should open up the offense so much more. And I think it does. I think Carolina really missed that last year. I know there was a lot of hype with bringing in Curtis Samuel and Damiere Byrd, but those 2 guys also weren't proven receivers. They weren't going to demand the respect down the field that a Ted Ginn or even a Torrey Smith can do going forward. And I also think that the more overrated or the more overlooked aspect of this trade, I should say, is, Ron Rivera is a big locker room guy. He's a big team chemistry guy.
Yep.
And as much hype as we've given, as the media has given, a Sammy Watkins or other prominent receivers out there, he also doesn't have the best background of Watkins does when it comes to work ethic and a locker room presence. You look at Torrey Smith's background. He's a Walter Payton Man of the Year candidate when he was with the 49ers.
Yep.
He's known as a great locker room guy with the Eagles. They're coming off a Super Bowl. And you mentioned the veteran presence Ron Rivera kind of pointed to earlier. Well, you can now have that presence in Torrey Smith, and you can still add a receiver if you want to in the draft in the 1st or 2nd round. And all of a sudden, if you do that and you get a guy you really like, you now have Devin Funchess, a 1st or 2nd round pick at receiver, a Torrey Smith, a Curtis Samuel if he gets back healthy, a Damiere Byrd, and all of a sudden that's a pretty good wide receiver corps. And I think people start to settle down a little bit.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And that's something, I think that's exactly what Rivera was hitting at when he said veteran at that combine presser, and in the with Jericho Cotchery's name being mentioned. And I think he hit the nail on the head there. And, moving on to Daryl Worley, I've seen, I was up and down on the post-game show all year. It was up and down. What's he going to do this week? And I've seen people talking about it on Twitter, but it really seems like Rivera was trying to give Kevon Seymour the opportunity to take that job. I mean, they were constantly in and out with these guys, rotating them, seeing who wanted to make a play and take that spot over. And Seymour just never quite did it. He played well at times, but he was just as inconsistent as Worley was. And there were times Worley flashed, and then there was times he was getting burnt and he was getting pass interference calls left and right. And as a whole, it's looking like they're really starting to rebuild this secondary, which is, it's kind of needed in some spots. The Kurt Coleman thing was kind of not a complete shock, but it wasn't as expected as some of the other cuts. Because you're losing that veteran leadership, and they had just paid him. I mean, he had a bad year in 2017, but now they're getting rid of Worley. And my whole thing with Steve Wilkes' scheme was it was mostly man and heavy blitzing, but I never felt like our personnel was good enough, and it showed the second half of the season when the defense just plummeted. And it seems now that they're going to rebuild that personnel, which makes me wonder if Eric Washington, we don't know what he's going to run yet. And it's making me wonder if maybe they're going to try to run that more man scheme. But as far as, there's several free agent cornerbacks going to be available, obviously. But right now the talk and the players with the Panthers are lobbying for, as I'm sure you've seen and everybody else, is Richard Sherman. I think this is more of I wouldn't say a pipe dream, but I don't think it's something that's really realistic that fans should grasp onto, do you?
No, I think we just talked about it earlier, but the Panthers are very rarely making those splash moves. Granted, they have done so more under the Marty Herney regime in the past before Dave Gettleman than they did under Gettleman, so you can't really rule it out. But they still only have, I think, saw a report yesterday that Carolina's down to under $20 million in cap space following the Torrey Smith trade. If you sign a guy like a Richard Sherman, you're going to take up a large chunk of that remaining cap space, and then that could be your last sizable move of the offseason when it comes to free agency, and then you'd be pretty much left with the draft. And I think if Carolina had a little bit more cap space, I think it would make a lot of sense. From a personnel standpoint, it does make sense, especially if, like you mentioned, Eric Washington wants to go to more of a man-to-man scheme where he can dial up some blitzes and not worry about a Daryl Worley getting burnt on the outside. Because let's be real, Daryl Worley, for what Sean McDermott ran with less blitzing and what the Panthers defense was when he was first drafted, there's a reason he and Bradbury were better in 2016 under that scheme, more so than last year when they relied more on the man coverage on the outside. So if Carolina wants to stick with that type of defense under Eric Washington, I do think it would be smart to bring in, a guy who maybe covers a little bit better one-on-one on the outside and doesn't rely so much on a zone type of scheme. So that's something that you have to consider. And also you have the draft. I mean, you could take a guy in the first or second round again. It just seems like every time I throw out, the possibility of Carolina taking a guy early in the draft to fill a need, you almost think about it in the back of your mind. This team really has a lot of needs. I mean, receiver,
it does,
offensive line, defensive ends, safety, corner. I mean, there's a lot of holes. Maybe not for this year specifically, but for 2019 and 2020 that Carolina has to think about filling pretty soon.
Yeah, and that's just it. I mean, you're sitting. All this talk was around. Early in the offseason was talking about receiver and getting Cam Newton help. And the funny thing is like you wouldn't have thought they would have opened up another hole in doing so. When you get rid of Worley, I mean, not that, we didn't already need help there. I mean, Worley, like we were saying, he wasn't the guy. I don't think he was going to be that guy. And the fact that Carolina traded for Torrey Smith when, he was likely going to hit free agency and you could possibly even have gotten him a little bit cheaper that way. The fact that they traded for him tells me that the staff was ready to move on from Daryl Worley in some aspect. So, I mean, I think those are solid points. But yeah, offensive line, defensive end. This last offseason when Dave Gettleman was bringing in all these vets and bringing former Panther players back, one of the things we talked about was they were going in a win now mode by doing so. But the downside of that was, after a year, I mean, a lot of these guys were aging, and how was it going to hold up in the long run of a tough, physical football season? And I think we saw some of that happen towards the end of last year. And then, of course, you got the injuries to Damiere Byrd and Curtis Samuel that ultimately hurt us. And now you're going to get a veteran guy like Torrey Smith that can help give you depth there. And, I feel like opening that hole could have, it seemed to cause a little bit of tension with Panther fans, and I understand it completely. But you almost wonder, like you said, you mentioned the draft. I'm sitting here wondering, are they going to go into the draft and take a guy at 24 to fill this spot to start and kind of do what Gettleman did a couple of years ago? Because now Hurney's getting rid of all of Gettleman's guys, it seems like. And it's just like throwing salt on his wound, I guess. But I don't necessarily see him going and getting a guy in the draft and saying you're going to be our starting cornerback. I still think, they may have some hope in Seymour and Ladarius Gunner still. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, and you still, obviously Corn Elder is going to be a nickel cornerback more than an outside guy. But, I'm still interested to see what he does, and can Captain Munderland improve upon last year's pretty up and down play. Like you said, I just think if they were willing to give up Worley for Torrey Smith in that situation, knowing what we know with the Eagles and their future with Torrey Smith, that he was probably going to be released, it's pretty clear that they were not sold on Worley as a starting cornerback. So everybody freaking out about, why give up a young, cheap player who can still get better? And he definitely can. He might still get better, but if he would have been on the team, clearly the Panthers wouldn't have much faith in him. Now they can kind of worry about rebuilding that hole, whether it be in free agency or the draft. And I think it does make things even more intriguing heading into the draft. And I think if you look at Carolina right now with free agency, about $20 million of cap space, I still think they can, hopefully restructure the deal of Ryan Khalil, maybe even either restructure or end up releasing Russell Shepard, depending on what happens there with his contract. You can still open up a little cap space.
Yeah.
I think they have room for maybe one more, pretty big signing. Pay a guy, $5 to $8 million to get him in, get a starting caliber player in, whether that's a safety position or a defensive end type of position, something like that. I think Carolina is going to make a somewhat of a big move in free agency and fill a hole there. And then I think we'll have more of an idea about where Carolina goes early in the draft. I think we'll find out here next week where they start to target in free agency. They're probably not going to get any major frontline guys, but there's still some second tier free agents, especially at safety. An Eric Reed or somebody like that who you can get for a relatively decent contract that you can plug in and start right away. So that's what I'm most interested in starting next week.
Yeah, and for those of you that don't know, the free agency legal tampering period, which is essentially where free agents can begin talks with other teams and, trying to work out getting a feel for each other and actually talking legally, starts Monday at 4 p.m. Free agency, however, does not start until Wednesday at 4 p.m. So that's about a 48-hour time period, which we're actually 48 hours away from the legal tampering. And there's already been a slew of trades this year. It's been pretty the Browns are just out there throwing stuff left and right, the Rams as well. So it's been kind of interesting there. And I see some of y'all commenting right now. Cody Latchney, so does the Smith signing guarantee we won't be getting Sammy Watkins? I obviously I can't guarantee that, but I would highly doubt that they're going to go after Watkins. I really feel like Watkins is going to get a little bit more than what I've seen some people talking about around the $5 or $6 million range. I feel like there's several teams out there that have money and that would be willing to spend a little bit, another $1 million or $2 million to guarantee he's there. And his next contract, and I think you'd agree, could range anywhere from 1 year term to 4, maybe not 5, but about 1 to 4 years. And obviously that changes the scheme of everything in money situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you look at him and he's only 24 years old. So, I kind of have two trains of thought on it. He could get after a pretty up and down year with Los Angeles last year, he could sign a short term, 1 2 year, 2 year type of deal where he's trying to prove it and get another big contract, or he could get a 4 or 5 year deal at the age of 24, still going into his prime. I mean, that's a pretty young receiver to be 4 years of NFL experience and to only be 24, and to have some pretty big numbers at the NFL level. So he's going to have an interesting market. Spot Rack, I think, projects him at getting a 3-year, $18 million contract.
Right, and that's about what I would think.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that as well. But you're right. If Carolina just decided to eat $5 million in Torrey Smith, they would have to spend another probably $6 to $7 million at least to get Sammy Watkins. When you're Carolina and you're strapped for cash right now, can you really spend $11 million on a pair of receivers? Some could probably make the argument you could, but then you're really limiting yourself when it comes to upgrading either the offensive line, defensive end, or secondary for the rest of the offseason. And there's also been reports of Carolina wanting to bring in a new backup quarterback, and even potentially looking into Teddy Bridgewater with Norv Turner's background with him, and he wouldn't be cheap either. So there are a lot of factors in play right now, and that's one thing. If you're right, if I had to guess, I would say the Panthers do not pursue Sammy Watkins, but I still don't think you can 100% rule it out as well. Yeah,
I mean, and here's the thing with, a lot of people are upset with this Torrey Smith trade, mainly because we're basically paying $5 million. And it's like you mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of comparisons with him and Ted Ginn because of the speed and because of the drop issues. But the thing with that is Ted Ginn was cheaper. He's always been cheaper than the $5 million we're going to pay Smith this year. Now, granted, it's about a $1.5 million difference or whatever a year from what Ginn ended up getting. But the thing with that is this move could also bring up another cut in a guy like Russell Shepard, who didn't pan out the way the Carolina Panthers hoped when DG signed him to. It wasn't a big contract, but I think it was a 3-year deal, and he's a $3.5 million cap hit. So if the bringing in Torrey Smith pushes out Shepard, all of a sudden it's essentially $1.5 million contract that they freed for Torrey Smith coming in, because it seems like Rivera really likes the potential of a young Kalen Clay in the long run. We've heard him talk about him and kind of praise him this offseason already, talking about that wide receiver room. You haven't heard him say Shepard's name much. They kind of brought Shepard in. I really thought, and a big part of it was because of the locker room presence that you mentioned, because that was one thing they talked about heavily in Tampa Bay, was he was really liked in the locker room. So if they push a guy like that out and cut him for more cap space, then all of a sudden, you've got a little bit more room to work with. And you also mentioned another, key signing or two. That's really about all Carolina has, and if they want to, kind of keep some cap space going into next season. I think if you go out and sign one or two more starters, that's going to, at their respective positions, wherever they may be, then that's really going to be about limited. I see somebody else asking about Paul Richardson. Is he still a possibility? And that guy, that's probably more of a guy you have a better opportunity of getting a guy like him than you would a Sammy Watkins, in my opinion. But he's another guy that could go out there and still get, $4 or $5 million a year. So it really just depends on where they want to spend it. Right now, there's a lot of holes, and I don't think you can go in the draft with holes at offensive line, defensive end, safety, cornerback, and go in there, draft a person at each of those positions and go start them. I think you have to still hit something in free agency.
Yeah, I agree. And Paul Richardson is an interesting name, kind of not the caliber of an Allen Robinson or Sammy Watkins. And maybe after those two guys sign somewhere, or you kind of feel the market for them, you can look into a Paul Richardson, see what's left. Because he doesn't have quite the resume of a Watkins or a Robinson, but last year had a breakout season, of course, more than 700 yards. Receiving 6 touchdowns. He also averaged 16 yards per catch. And, that's a big-time deep threat. His game is built on speed, much like Torrey Smith. So a similar player from that perspective, but also a guy who's young, too. He's only 25. He'll be 26 next season. And if Carolina does have any money left over that they feel like they can spend at receiver, then maybe you do go after a Paul Richardson if you make a move with Russell Shepard. And then that way, if you go into the NFL draft knowing that your receiving corps is pretty much set, then you can focus on the trenches. You can focus on the secondary, which is what I really think, Carolina needs to focus on. When I was first looking at this offseason, my biggest necessity for this Panthers team was safety. And I think now it only becomes more imperative after you part ways with Kurt Coleman. The safety play just hasn't been good in Carolina for a number of years now. They haven't drafted a safety in the first round since Thomas Davis. And, of course, he ended up playing linebacker. He was drafted as a safety out of Georgia. I think started his career there and was playing linebacker by the end of his rookie season. So it's been a while since this organization has put a safety on the priority list. And I think if they don't sign one in free agency, they have got to draft one in rounds 1 or 2 come April.
Yeah, and I completely agree there. I was reading something here. Monica Hillian comment on Facebook Live here. Y'all be sure to like and follow us right here if you haven't already. Go ahead and share this so we can get some more Panther fans in here and y'all can keep discussing these things. Monica is saying, are they really thinking about getting rid of Thomas Davis and Ryan Khalil because they wanted Shaq Thompson to step up more anyway? I don't think Thomas Davis or Ryan Khalil were going in anywhere. They've announced this is their last season and they're going to retire. The Panthers organization, Marty Hurney and Ron Rivera, I don't see them getting rid of Thomas Davis or Ryan Khalil in their final year. Not to mention they still bring a lot to this team playing-wise. I mean, Thomas Davis is still a very good linebacker. And remember, we had the same discussion last offseason, Igoe. It was what everybody kept talking about. Even the coaching staff had mentioned it, where Shaq Thompson was going to take on more of a role for Thomas Davis, and it never happened. And I think that's something to watch this year. I'm sure they will probably rotate him in more so than not this year because it is TD's last year, but it never happened last year either. And something else I wanted to discuss while we're on that subject of veterans, Greg Olson was looking for an extension last year. He's a $9 million cap hit this year. Restructuring his contract could free up a couple of $1 million in cap as well, because they could backload the bonuses on those and maybe free up some more money for another move somewhere else. They're also going to be looking for his replacement.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people aren't talking about. And also, I mean, and we kind of hinted at it earlier, just from a standpoint of needs. You have Greg Olsen, contract set to expire after 2018. Devin Funchess' contract set to expire after 2018. Daryl Williams, nobody's talking about that. Everybody's talking about Andrew Norwell. Well, Daryl Williams,
he had a huge year. Yep.
Yeah, had a breakout year. Starting right tackle, he's in line for a big payday. So those are three pretty big decisions. If you're Carolina, you do have an option with Shaq Thompson that'll probably get picked up. That'll take him through 2019. So yeah, I don't think you definitely can't cut Thomas Davis or Ryan Khalil. I would at least approach Khalil and say, hey man, you've missed, 20 games over the past 2 years or whatever the number is, and you're on the books for our fifth highest salary of the season. We just can't have this right now. Could you please work with us? And hopefully knowing Khalil and the guy he is would agree to some type of pay cut just to help out the organization. I think Thomas Davis's cap hit is relatively fair.
Yes.
Khalil's is a little high. But yeah, I mean, I think that Olsen decision, that is going to be a tough one. And if you're the Panthers right now, I think you have to wait and see. The guy was injured for the first time in his career last season for a long-term injury. He missed a lot of games. He clearly was dependable when he still came back, but he's well over 30 now, not going into the prime of his career. So you almost have to play out the season, see what effectiveness he can be at returning from the injury, and then make the decision from there. But again, more difficult decisions for the Panthers, and this is why a lot of people are, I guess, somewhat skeptical of Marty Herney being the full-time GM now, at least for this season, because there are a lot of big decisions to make over this next calendar year, and a guy who was once fired from the position is now set to make them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we talked about it last offseason. These next 2 or 3 years in Carolina were going to be really tough for any GM. We were talking about how much money Dave Gettleman had piled up when he came here and got us unstrapped. We were, $50 million under the cap. Everything was great, and everybody was like, "We need to spend it. We need to spend it." And it's, Gettleman was doing this for a reason, because he saw these issues coming with bigger guys and contracts and people retiring and having to bring in young talent and hit free agency at some point. These next, this year and the next year are going to be pretty huge when you're talking about the faces of what's been the Panthers franchise for the last decade, essentially. You've already seen it gone. It's the end of an era with Charles Johnson, Jonathan Stewart. And now, Kurt Coleman was only here for a few years, but he had an impact those first two, especially the 2015 magical season. So all of those things, I mean, it's going to be really interesting how they work through it while trying to get Cam weapons all at the same time and, try to get back to the Super Bowl. Cody Latchney, I just hope everybody is ready to be super disappointed in our free agency this year. We aren't going to get anyone the fan base wants or a player that isn't considered bargain bin. Maybe to an extent. I don't know about all that. They're going to have to be wise with their money, obviously, because we're strapped. They can't help that. It's not like there's just money growing on trees out there for them. So, and then TK Gainey saying bring back Trey Boston, which is an interesting thought. But I also feel like Trey Boston kind of had a breakout year himself with LA Chargers. He could probably go somewhere and get paid as well.
Yeah, he's coming off a very big season. Signed that 1 year prove it deal with the Chargers, and to his credit, he proved that he was a legit starting safety. For everybody that is a Dave Gettleman detractor, you can definitely point to that release as a potential mistake heading into last year. Granted, I think he was going into the last year of his contract, so he would have been a free agent this offseason either way, but it would have been nice to have Trey Boston last year when Kurt Coleman was struggling, with some injuries, also struggling with some play. You weren't very deep at safety, and you cut a guy who wasn't expensive just to kind of, I guess, open up a roster spot. So Trey Boston is going to get paid. I guess with a new GM, you could entertain bringing him back, but it's kind of like we talked about earlier. Do you have the funds to do it? I think if you're Carolina, you want to put money into that position. Is Trey Boston the right guy? Do you want to go after a Kenny Vaccaro or Eric Reed, somebody new with some fresh blood. I mean, that's a conversation only Gettleman and Rivera are having right now, I suppose. But there are options on the table from a free agency perspective at safety. And if you do want to bring Trey Boston back, you're going to have to pay him, but it certainly wouldn't be the worst move in the world.
Yeah, definitely not. A lot of, familiar there. Billy Deaton, we need a legit deep threat wide receiver. And I keep seeing this. And here's my thing is another reason with the Torrey Smith, like Curtis Samuel shows a lot of promise moving forward, but he has to be on the field for that. And he missed nearly all of last offseason with an injury. And then when he came back in the regular season and finally started, flashing, he went down and missed the rest of the season with an ankle injury, which is pretty severe from the way they've been, with the ligament damage and all. It's going to take him a while to rehab, and who knows how he's going to come back and if he'll ever come back to full health, because ankle injuries like that can linger, and it's kind of worrisome. But Carolina can't wait on that with Cam Newton in his prime years at 28 years old and, only getting older each year. They have to capitalize now. They need to be in that win now mode. And I think that's why you saw a guy like Torrey Smith come up. And I still think they could possibly still draft a wide receiver in later rounds. I'm not a fan of Calvin Ridley at 24. I just think it'd be a mistake. If you like to say best player available at like a 24 spot or in the draft period, but Carolina has to address some needs in the draft. And I don't think they have a choice not to, honestly. And Ridley at 24 would be that splashy, flashy look, wide receiver skill position. But I really think the way they've opened up these holes, especially after getting Torrey Smith now, they kind of have depth at receiver there if, Samuel or Bird go down. But I just don't know that I'd like to see a receiver at 24. I think you have to get one of the more elite, defensive ends, offensive linemen, or like you even mentioned, safety. I think safety comes off the board round one or two unless they find that guy in free agency, which, like I said, I don't. They'd have to spend a little bit of money, obviously, to do that.
Yeah, I think Calvin Ridley, if he falls to 24, would be an interesting fit. He didn't test as well at the combine outside of the 40 than a lot of people expected. I think the broad jump and the vertical leap wasn't what people were looking for from Calvin Ridley. So it would be interesting to see what those numbers do as far as his draft stock. I think you can get a quality receiver in round 2. If you're Carolina, you also have 2 third-round picks, which is, in my opinion, you got to fill those. You got to fill receiver, all these holes, defensive end, offensive line, in the first 3 rounds if you want them to have a chance to play this year. I mean, that's just a realistic take from the standpoint of what NFL draft picks are typically ready to play right away. So if you're looking to fill immediate needs, you can still get a receiver like Anthony Miller.
Yes.
A guy like that in round 2, DJ Moore from Maryland, perhaps. So there are guys there after the first round. If you want to, spend an offensive lineman pick, a Billy Price, I know he got injured at the combine, but he's still a very interesting prospect to me.
Yes.
So, we'll see. I mean, I think there are, I guess the good thing is with having so many needs is, I guess the best player available, there's a good chance he will come at a position of need for Carolina.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Come the NFL draft. So it should be, it should be a really interesting draft, and it could be the most important draft in the last, 5 to 10 years for the Panthers. With so many needs, you're kind of at this point where the window is closing for the Cam Newton era, but you're also at the point where a lot of veterans are going to be gone soon, and you got to start building for the future. So you got to have a good draft at a number of positions with the cap space situation being what it is, build for the future, and also get guys who can play right away. And we've seen Ron Rivera do that with McCaffrey, Shaq Thompson, a lot of other recent draft picks, Kelvin Benjamin and whatnot. So it's going to be an interesting April, March for sure with free agency, but I'm excited to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, definitely so. A lot of stuff going on in Charlotte. Owner, free agency, holes to fill, cutting veterans, cap, Marty Herney just taking over GM. I mean, it's madness right now. It's hard to keep up with all of it. It's hard to report on all of it. but alas, here we are trying to do the best we can with it. I appreciate you jumping on today, buddy. If y'all would go ahead and like and follow us right here. You can follow us on Twitter at PantherSource. Follow me on subscribe to YouTube. It's all at PantherSource right there. Igoe, again, I appreciate you joining. I hope to get you back up here again. It's always good to have you. You want to plug anything? All this, your Twitter and whatnot.
Well, first off, man, I appreciate you having me on. Good to talk with you as always. Always a fun time. You do a good job, covering the Panthers for PantherSource, and always good to talk with you. But yeah, just, if you're unfamiliar with our 24/7 sports coverage,
which I doubt you are. If you're watching this, you probably have liked his page, but the 24/7 sports page, they're posting stuff up there all the time. But go ahead.
Yeah. Facebook is our biggest avenue for traffic this day and age. You can like us on Carolina Panthers on 24/7 Sports on Facebook. Obviously, we're also very active on our own site, car.247sports.com. Typically have 5 to 7 stories a day at minimum on that site, just whether it be aggregated content from other reports or our own breakdowns of free agency candidates for Carolina to go after, or draft prospects the Panthers should look after, or potential trades or potential cuts or whatnot. We try to cover it all on 24/7 Sports, so check us out, and definitely check Trip Morgan's workout as well, because can't have enough Panthers coverage this day and age, my man.
No, definitely not with all this stuff going on. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Like I said, like and follow and share and all that jazz. Keep the discussions coming. I'll try to get up here and reply to some of y'all's comments if you have any questions after the fact. And y'all keep pounding.